Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment and ask that you check me out on Patreon at www.patreon.com/CanadaEHX. There are several tiers with great benefits, from ad-free content to t-shirts and other cool stuff. And if you're a fan of Canadian History X, make sure you check out my other shows, From John to Justin and Canada, A Yearly Journey. And don't forget, you can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com. It helps keep this show going. All right, on with the show. It's a quiet Saturday night in 1979. Residents in Mississauga, Ontario, are asleep. The next day is expected to be a quiet one for thousands that live there. Many would be looking forward to a nice breakfast with families, maybe some time with a newspaper crossword puzzle, or even a walk to honor fallen heroes of the Great Wars. Not only is it Remembrance Day, it's also a Sunday. But that's not what happened. 7 minutes before midnight on November 10th, 1979, the city center of Mississauga was rattled as windows shook and fireballs shot into the sky. Within 24 hours, it became the site of the largest peacetime evacuation in North American history. I'm Craig Baird, this is Canadian History X, and today I am sharing the story of the miracle that was the Mississauga train derailment. Before we get to the train derailment, let's look at the history of Mississauga. That story begins on August 2nd, 1805, when Toronto Township was formed by officials from York, now Toronto, who purchased 85,000 acres of land from the Mississaugas under Treaty 14. Over time, the community began to grow, and by the 1920s, Mississauga was a popular place for residents of Toronto to visit to take advantage of the cottages along Lake Ontario. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, Mississauga was more rural than urban, but a shift began in the 1960s. In 1965, with the desire to become a town put to area residents, they were given a choice of two names, Mississauga or Sheridan. By a vote of 11,976 to 4,331, Mississauga won, and the town of Mississauga was created. Within a decade, it was clear that more urbanization was needed. In 1974, Mississauga amalgamated with Port Credit and Streetsville to form the city of Mississauga. The city grew over the next few years as lands were annexed and the Square One shopping center was opened. Today, it's the largest shopping center in Ontario and the second largest in Canada. And as the 1970s decade came to a close, Mississauga was about to become the center of one of the most significant disasters in Canadian history. In the morning of November 10, 1979, Canadian Pacific Train 54 was traveling along the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad in the United States, pulling along several cars. It crossed into Canada and collected a few more cars in Sarnia, including one tanker filled with chlorine. There were 3 locomotives pulling the 106 cars, manned by a 3-man crew: conductor Ted Nickel, engineer Keith Pruce, and his son-in-law and brakeman Larry Krupa. The journey to Toronto was expected to be simple as the train lumbered along at about 100 kilometers per hour. But far behind the locomotive, about 1/3 of the way down the long train, disaster loomed as the 33rd car developed problems. One of the cars of the train was improperly lubricated, causing friction and heat to build up as the train made its way towards Mississauga. Anyone waiting at a crossing, waiting for the train to pass, would see smoke and sparks fly as the 33rd car in the line passed by. When the train passed another train, the crew smelled smoke when it reached the car. Eventually, the intense heat burned a hole through the axle and bearing, creating a loss of integrity, and with that, the wheel started to wobble. At 11:53 p.m., it reached a critical point, and with a sudden jolt, a wheel set consisting of an axle and a pair of wheels, fell off the train completely. Lynn Riddle lived nearby and heard a loud bang, and looked towards the train crossing and saw a red-hot set of wheels fly 15 meters in the air. It landed in her backyard. Her father-in-law lived next door and ran over with a garden hose to spray the fiery wheels. Meanwhile, without the axle, the train car immediately jumped the track, and there was no stopping the disaster. 3 kilometers away from the train crossing, Ron DeBoer and his wife Kay noticed sparks flying into the sky. Unbeknownst to them on the track, tankers began smashing into each other, tearing through metal as they flew off the rails as propane, styrene, and caustic soda began to pour out. Thinking quickly, Ron DeBoer put his car into reverse and gunned the engine. In a split second, a fireball shot up 1.5 kilometers into the air, lighting up the dead of night. People 100 kilometers away saw the sky suddenly brighten in the distance. The explosion was followed by a massive shockwave that rocked Mississauga. While the chain of events leading up to the train derailment began outside the city, the actual derailment itself was not far from the city center. Thousands of people, homes, and businesses were located in the area around the tracks. Rob Johnston, lead audio and sound design for Curious Cast's podcast network, was a child at the time and says that at first he didn't know what had happened.
So when it happened, I would have been about 8 years old, and it was a Saturday night, and I remember my parents had some friends over, Saturday night playing cards, socializing, all that. And I was going to bed, and all of a sudden, this huge daylight came from behind the blind from outside, and then a big muffled sound. And that was it. And I remember opening up the blinds, the curtains to take a look, and I didn't see anything. The explosion where the derailment happened would have been about 6 kilometers away from where we lived, so it wasn't visible from where we were. But something had happened, but we just weren't sure what it was.
Meanwhile, Alfie McCann, another resident, thought it was the worst case scenario. He said, "I thought it was a nuclear attack. I was sure it was the end. I'd gone to bed just before midnight when all hell broke loose. I jumped out of bed and looked out the window. The sky was lit up with a huge orange flame." Wayne Zimmer was a 13-year-old boy living near the crash site. He had a more whimsical idea. He thought it was a spaceship from another galaxy landing in Mississauga. John McGloshin, who lived only 3 blocks away, said, "It was horrific. Our house shook, the windows rattled. The sky was a bright orange, and when I saw the fireball, we were already running to the car, only with the clothes we had on. And on our way out of the city, we didn't even know where we were going." Cal Miller, who worked for the Toronto Sun as a staff writer and lived close by, said, "There was a deafening roar, a brilliant glow and intense heat as I stepped out from a building that shielded me from the flaming train wreck. I dropped to my stomach and pressed my body close to the building. The daylight glow lasted for about a minute, and soon the roof of the building that protected me was afire." The DeBoers, who saw the train spewing sparks in front of them, reversed their car straight into a ditch, then leapt out of the car and ran for their lives, leaving behind a $10,000 fur coat in the back seat. Meanwhile, at the front of the train, the 3-man crew were sitting ducks. The sudden loss of cars behind the locomotive caused the air pressure to fall, and the brakes locked automatically as the fireball erupted, with the 32 cars connected to the locomotive still on the track. Larry Krupa, the brakeman, yelled to Keith Pruce that they had a tanker on fire. Pruce could see flames going 40 stories in the air, and the line of derailing cars piling up, adding more fuel to the inferno. Pruce said, "It was like a small Hiroshima. It was like flaming hell back there. I had visions of all those homes being engulfed." Pruce asked his son-in-law to free the tankers. Krupa gave a simple, "Okay." As Krupa jumped from the locomotive, Pruce wondered if he would have to tell his daughter that he watched her husband die that night. Without thinking of his own safety, Krupa ran down the train towards the burning cars and uncoupled 2 tankers, allowing his father-in-law to pull the remaining cars from the glowing fire and 2 kilometers down the track. Krupa's quick thinking and bravery saved the lives of the crew and prevented the disaster from becoming much worse. Pruce said, "He wasn't hurt, thank God, but I'll tell you, I'm his father-in-law. I wouldn't have done that. He's the boy who deserves the credit. If he hadn't have done that, more than half of Mississauga would have gone up.
Huge explosions send flames thousands of feet into the night sky, and the incident causes the biggest peacetime evacuation in the history of North America. Keith Pruce was the engineer on that train.
It was like slow motion. It went straight up in the air, at slow motion, all these beautiful sparks coming off it. And when it got pretty high, then the end blew out of it and it just took off like a rocket.
Larry Krupa was the brakeman on the train and one of the heroes that day.
I got off the engine and walked back the 32 cars, or whatever it was, and closed the angle cock, which enabled Keith to pull the train down to a safer location.
As soon as people reported a giant explosion, firefighters in Mississauga rushed to the scene. At 12:01 a.m., less than 10 minutes later, a second explosion rocked Mississauga as a tanker car was thrown 1 kilometer away. The first responder on scene was Bob Baird, a police officer. He said, "I had my back to the wreck and she blew. My hair was singed. I felt I was dead."
Live from the Emergency Command Center in Mississauga.
Good evening. It is like a battlefield headquarters.
Just minutes before midnight on Saturday, November 10th, 1979, 24 train cars and tankers, brimming with a devil's brew of toxic and explosive chemicals, derailed in the middle of Mississauga.
I was in bed, and my youngest son, awakened me. He said, "Mom, I think the city hall is blown up."
She quickly learned it wasn't City Hall.
It was chaotic. It was dangerous.
Gordon Bentley was Peel's fire chief at the time.
And we had fires scattered all along here.
He was looking at a scene from hell. Tanks of burning liquid propane threw flames 1,500 meters into the night sky. The inferno could be seen 100 kilometers away. Of most concern was a 90-ton tank of chlorine, which was ripped open after a massive propane tank exploded.
As we ran, the flames were just an incredible growth of flames and heat on our backs.
That was Kathleen and Ron DeBoer 25 years ago. Given how near they were to the derailment, they are very lucky to be alive and well today.
The first explosion threw us up in the air, and we got up, kept on running. The second one was the worst. That was the one that was like a huge, big atomic bomb.
Meanwhile, Charlene Heath, a local resident, said, "We heard a major explosion. We watched as a tanker car was projected 100 feet in the air. The sky was burning red." The flash from the explosion was so big, it was seen in Niagara Falls, 70 kilometers southeast of Mississauga, and reported to police. In Toronto, tens of thousands were woken from their sleep by the sound. Tom Gooden thought it was a different type of accident. He stated, "My first thought was that a plane went down. I remember that the first blast woke me in Malton, and I saw the second fireball from my apartment. It was a scary situation." Firefighter Charlie Duncan had just arrived on the scene when the explosion happened. He said, "I was laying lines and I can remember hearing a hissing noise. I knew there would be an explosion and turned to run. I saw large pieces of metal flying by. I thought, if the radiant heat doesn't get ya, one of those will. Something hit me in the back, I don't know what it was. My coat was steaming, so I lay in the ditch to cool it off. It was a matter of obligation to go back to put the fire out. It's as simple as that." In Toronto's West End, Marie Lusinger-Busick was walking out of her wedding reception when she saw Mississauga's sky burning red, and emergency lines across Toronto were flooded with calls. Every firefighter and police officer in Mississauga was soon joined by the Metro Toronto Police, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Ontario Provincial Police. One group of firefighters were at a wedding 30 kilometers away in Georgetown. They dropped everything and arrived wearing fire gear over their tuxedos. But as they arrived, they quickly realized there was little they could do. The flames were burning so hot they couldn't come close. Their only course of action was to use water to cool down the cars and wait for the fire to burn out. And this would have been a fine plan except for one thing. In the inferno, buried in the mangled wreckage, was the car they picked up in Sarnia. It carried 90 tons of liquid chlorine. At the time, it was believed that 70% of the chlorine burned up in the fireball that shot up 1.5 kilometers into the atmosphere, but there was no way to know for sure. If the fire ignited the liquid chlorine, it would turn it into a poisonous gas called phosgene, also called chlorine gas. Chlorine gas at room temperature was used as a chemical weapon during the First World War. leading to the deaths of 85,000 soldiers. If chlorine gas were produced by the fire, it would put hundreds of thousands of people in Mississauga, and even Toronto, at risk. Such a scenario was not out of the realm of possibility. Only 4 years earlier, an explosion of a rail tanker full of chlorine killed 4 people in Niagara Falls, New York. In Youngstown, Florida, in the mid-1970s, chlorine gas leaked from a derailed tank car and choked the motors of passing cars, leaving 8 people trapped, where they died, struggling to breathe. There was only one course of action then for Mississauga in 1979: evacuation. And it would fall on the new mayor of Mississauga, Hazel McCallion. Hazel McCallion was born in 1921 in Port Daniel, Quebec, to a father who owned a fishing and canning company and a stay-at-home mom. As an adult, she became a star hockey player for the local team and eventually went on to become a professional player, making $5 a game for a Montreal team as part of a 3-team women's league. She had desires to study in university, but her family couldn't afford it. So instead, she went to work for Kellogg for almost 2 decades until she was ready for a new challenge: politics. McCallion became a new member of the Streetsville Planning Board in 1964 and served as the chair of the board in 1966 and again in 1968. Later that year, she became the deputy reeve of Streetsville and then elected mayor of Streetsville in 1970, serving until December 1973 when Streetsville amalgamated with the town of Mississauga and the town of Port Credit. In this new municipality of the city of Mississauga, McCallion was elected to city council and kept her seat, winning by acclamation in 1976. From 1974 to 1978, she sat on nearly every committee in the city, along with various federal and provincial committees. McCallion became known as a forceful personality with boundless energy to get things done. It earned her the nickname of Hurricane Hazel, after the deadly hurricane that struck Toronto in the 1950s. And on December 1st, 1978, she was elected mayor of Mississauga, defeating incumbent Ron Searle by 3,000 votes and becoming the first woman to hold that post. She had no idea one of the biggest challenges of her mayoral career was just around the corner. On November 11th, 1979 at 1:30 a.m., police began to knock on the doors of the homes in the immediate area, ordering people to drop everything and evacuate. 6,000 people were impacted by the first order and sent to Square One shopping mall, which became an emergency center. McCallion said, "When I got dressed, I rushed down to Square One and I saw these people there, and they'd come in their night clothes. People left without their prescriptions. It was a very serious situation, so we had to get organized." One of those evacuees was Matthew Wilkinson. He was a young child at the time and doesn't remember being moved as his mother never woke him when they left home. He went to bed in Mississauga and woke up in Oakville. His father was working at the hospital and had no idea where his family had gone, and it took him half a day to locate them. Meanwhile, at the crash site, firefighters poured water on the chlorine tank in the fire to keep it as cool as possible. At 4 a.m., a third explosion erupted as more propane tanks ignited, which caused a second wave of evacuations. Gertrude Hamill was one of 27,000 people evacuated and described the terrifying situation. She said, "It's impossible to describe the anxiety we had on having to leave our homes and not being allowed back into our homes. It was especially horrifying to leave pets behind, not knowing if you'd return to wagging tails or not. People went to City Hall to drop off their house keys, hoping emergency crews could feed their pets. At 6 a.m., firefighters and emergency personnel discovered that chlorine tanker was leaking from a 1-meter-sized hole. The discovery was made just as firefighters were starting to make headway. They continued to allow a controlled burn while concentrating water on the chlorine tank to keep it from heating up and exploding. Every firefighter and emergency personnel knew that if the chlorine gas was released, they would be the first victims, gasping for air. As the sun came up, buses and ambulances lined up at the Mississauga hospital to begin evacuation efforts. Soon after, the wind picked up and more people were told to drop everything and leave their homes. Rob Johnston woke up that morning, knowing something odd had happened the night before, but unaware of what was to come for his family and the rest of Mississauga.
So the next morning was the Sunday, and people in the neighborhood had heard about something going on, but it was hard to get information as to exactly what. You know, keep in mind, this is 1979. We didn't have 24-hour news channels. We didn't have any kind of information like that. There were some news reports of a big explosion and train derailment in central Mississauga down on Mavis Road. Ironically, the train derailment was just up the road from a Rogers Cable 10 television station, community television station from back in the day. So they would have been the first ones on the scene running a camera to try and capture what was going on. And I remember we would tune into Cable 10 and there was a static shot of the fire and, you know, a huge plume of water coming off of one of the fire trucks, off one of the cranes onto the, I guess it would have been the chlorine tanker to try and keep it cool.
Peel Regional Police officers drove through neighborhoods and over loudspeakers told residents to leave. Officers then knocked on every door to make sure people had left or were in the process of leaving. Some refused to leave, believing the threat was not as bad as reported. Willow Wilson, an elderly woman, stayed in her home with 4 members of her family. When asked later why she didn't leave, she said, "I don't know. We just decided to stay. I didn't feel it was that important." As the morning went on, things didn't improve, and the evacuees who were at the Square One Mall were sent to high school gyms farther away as the risk increased. James Fleming, the assistant editor of Maclean's magazine, was living in a 20-story apartment building with his wife and new baby Sarah when the blast rocked them awake. They stayed in their home that first night. The next morning he called the police and was told he was on the fringe of the evacuation area. Fleming said, "I didn't like the sound of his voice, so we threw some clothes into a suitcase and went to my parents' home in Oakville. We could smell the chlorine."
The threat of chlorine poisoning started the biggest peacetime evacuation in North American history.
Police told them, don't even take time to get dressed, just get out.
Shopping malls like Square One became a refuge for thousands.
Have you had any sleep?
How can you sleep in this? No.
As night turned into day, fires still burned and poisonous fumes slowly seeped out.
We watched the weather very, very carefully to know exactly when the wind was going to change, which direction, because that determined what areas we had to additional evacuation.
In all, about 220,000 people, almost the entire population of Mississauga, left their homes. 6 nursing homes and 3 hospitals were also evacuated. Roadblocks were set up so no one could get into the city. Mississauga became a virtual ghost town.
I started to look around and...
Back in Toronto, new bride, Marie, who saw the red sky over Mississauga the night before, was surprised when several of her guests attending the luncheon reception were still wearing their formal outfits from the night before. That's when she learned of the disaster and that many of her guests were unable to return home. At 1 p.m. on November 11th, experts from Dow Chemical were now in the area and ran a computer simulation to produce the weather forecast for the next 3 days. Realizing that the weather was not going to help them, the city officials expanded the evacuation boundary. Over 70,000 people from an area covering 64 square kilometers were now displaced. Russ Harris, who went by the nickname Lucky, was in his camper on his way to do some fishing on his Sunday off. As he approached the roadblock, a police officer told him, "You're not going to be doing any fishing today. Get the hell out of here." As Harris drove away, he realized he forgot his heart medication. He turned back, but the cop stopped him again. When Harris asked where he could park his camper in case he had a heart problem, the officer told him to follow his patrol car. That night, Harris slept in his camper outside the police station. The next morning, he heard a knock on the camper door and said, "I opened it, and there was a cop standing with a plate of bacon and eggs. Beautiful." By 3:40 p.m., a 6th evacuation order was issued, which included all nearby nursing homes and the Queensway General Hospital. Evacuees from earlier in the day were displaced once again, this time to the International Trade Center on Airport Road. By now, Rob Johnston and his family were leaving the city as well.
We first started hearing about evacuations through the news, through radio and television, and it would have started off in a small area near where the train derailment happened on Mavis Road in central Mississauga area. And as I said, we were about 6 kilometers from there where we lived. We were close to the Oakville-Mississauga border. And as the day progressed, they kept expanding the evacuation zone. And I remember my parents, we were talking about, well, what, do you think we'll be evacuated? Well, there was a good possibility. Well, where do you think we can go? And we had a lot of friends and some relatives in Mississauga and Etobicoke area. And it didn't seem like that would have been obviously the right place to go. You couldn't go anywhere in Mississauga. Etobicoke was close to Mississauga, and maybe that might have been downwind from these clouds of gas that they were anticipating could happen if there was an explosion. So we ended up going to Burlington, which is west of Mississauga, about 25 kilometers west of Mississauga. And we went and stayed at friends of my parents' place. And it was a bit of an adventure. You got to keep in mind, I'm 8 years old. My sister's a teenager at the time, and we had a few days off school. And it was sort of this, weird adventure of, wow, we're going to get evacuated and we'll keep on the news and we'll see what's happening. So that's what happened to us. We ended up getting evacuated and piling in the car and going out to Burlington for a few days.
Over 1,000 patients were relocated from the hospitals in Mississauga, and dozens of ambulances borrowed from hospitals across the region. As firefighters did their best to cool down the burning wreckage, a 7th evacuation order was issued. This included neighboring Oakville, Ontario. James Fleming and his family, who had left their apartment for his parents' place in Oakville, were now being evacuated to Collingwood, 123 kilometers to the south. 24 hours after the derailment, 250,000 people were evacuated from Mississauga and the surrounding area in the largest peacetime evacuation in North American history. At 12:30 a.m., Mayor Hazel McCallion told the media that no one was to be in Mississauga. She said the city was closed until further notice. Meanwhile, people in Hamilton and Toronto's West End sat on pins and needles, wondering if they too would have to evacuate. And at the crash site, exhausted firefighters continued to work around the clock to do what they could to avoid a deadly disaster. The work of the firefighters was beginning to pay off. Things were cooling down, and it seemed the risk of chlorine gas explosions was falling with each passing hour. But 15 kilograms of liquid chlorine was still leaking out of the tanker by the hour, so there was still a risk. Mississauga was like a post-apocalyptic movie, as an eerie silence fell over the entire city. And on the 3rd day, the fires were finally out, but the chlorine was still leaking. It was estimated that 75% had evaporated into the atmosphere. Emergency personnel also drained remaining propane tankers to prevent a 4th explosion. At one point, 2 small eruptions sent plumes of chlorine gas high into the air. The poisonous cloud hung briefly over the area, but then the wind blew it south over Lake Ontario. At 1 p.m. on November 14th, 11,000 evacuees were allowed to return to their homes. And everyone was in such a rush that it created a 7-hour traffic jam. Others lined up at barricades so they could be ready to go home as soon as they were given the all clear. On the 4th day, emergency crews were pumping out the chlorine remaining in the tanker, a process that continued into day 5. And that's when the first major injuries were reported, when 8 firefighters accidentally walked into a pocket of chlorine gas and were hospitalized. Thankfully, for the rest of the day, more evacuees returned home. And finally, on the 6th day, emergency crews had drained almost all the liquid chlorine from the tanker. Deputy Fire Chief Ross Kelly said of the entire situation, "That was the frightening part, not knowing what it would do. It was not like other fires where at least you know what is going to happen. The amazing thing was, no one backed down. We just kept going and going at it, and we beat it." With the risk of chlorine gas explosions now gone, half the remaining 33,000 evacuees were allowed home by the afternoon. And 6 days after the disaster began, at 7:42 p.m., the last evacuation order was lifted, and the remaining evacuees walked back through their front doors. Mississauga was finally reopened. The November 26, 1979 cover of Maclean's featured a picture of a burning wreckage, and in large letters the headline, Mississauga Nightmare. But that wasn't entirely accurate. The Halifax explosion of 1917 killed 2,000 people and injured 9,000. You can hear all about that in my podcast episode from early 2024. That was a nightmare. The Mississauga train derailment wasn't even close to a tragedy. It was more of a miracle. How many people died due to the Mississauga train derailment? 0. Injuries? Beyond the hospitalized firefighters, there was one injury. Hazel McCallion sprained her ankle while at the wreck site. But that didn't stop her from giving updates to the press and citizens. At one point, Ontario Provincial Police Deputy Commissioner Jim Erskine carried her into a press conference.
Then, 6 days after the derailment, the all clear was sounded. The last of the evacuees returned to their homes. While a handful of houses were damaged, except for Mary McCallion, who sprained her ankle giving a news interview, miraculously, there were no other injuries.
I described it as Mississauga miracle, even though it was a disaster. But it was a miracle the way in which it was managed and the outcome of it.
This is Global's Therese Sears reporting.
Dead pets? None. Well, one pet. A cat that was left alone in a house decided the law of the jungle applied, and it ate the canary it shared a home with. But thanks to emergency personnel and volunteers in the city, over 10,000 cats, dogs, and other pets that were left in homes over the course of those 6 days were fed, and there were no more pet victims. Buildings and crumbling ruins from the explosion. Beyond the area around the railway line that was hit by the explosion, most places dealt with, at most, a few broken or cracked windows. That's why they call the event the Mississauga Miracle. And at the heart of the story is the fast-thinking hero Larry Krupa, the tireless dedication of emergency crews. Hazel McCallion said, "If this had happened a half-mile farther down the track, either east or west, we would have seen thousands of people wiped out. It's a miracle it happened here." And for the residents like Rob Johnston, the disaster became a "where were you when" moment in their lives.
Looking back, there's I guess you could say, a bit of a lore for us who grew up in Mississauga at the time. You know, as you went through school, middle school, elementary school, high school, you started working, getting jobs, and meeting more people from across Mississauga. It kind of became this point of conversation like, oh, were you here during the train derailment? Oh, and where did you go to? Where did you evacuate to? And when I see evacuations now, a lot of them are coming from natural disasters, hurricanes, forest fires, things like that. And we were fortunate, I suppose, in that we didn't have to necessarily worry about our property being lost to what was happening. It was just this uncertainty of this potential of the chlorine tanker exploding and a cloud of poisonous gas, I guess, and whatever else would come from that. But we knew when the evacuation was over, we'd be coming back to our houses and back to our homes. We wouldn't be dealing with any of these natural disaster situations. So I guess in a way, we were very fortunate, because when I see other people evacuating for those circumstances, it's quite emotional, quite overwhelming for them. I guess for us, it was just part of this adventure.
But what happened when life went back to normal? The Mississauga train derailment has been studied by many other cities and become a model for emergency plans. In the United States and Canada, regulations changed so that any rail line carrying hazardous goods into or near a major populated area had to have hotbox detectors. These detectors can identify a problem like the one that occurred in Mississauga before the wheels literally fall off the train.
5 years later, not a trace of the disaster remains here now, the spot where emergency crews struggled for a week to cap the leaking tank car. Could it happen again? It could, of course. But the railways and the government say they've done a lot to make another disaster much less likely.
In the past 2 years, there have been more than 150 rail accidents annually involving hazardous cargoes, none as serious as Mississauga. In hopes of limiting the damage in future, Mr. Justice Samuel Grange conducted an inquiry in the wake of Mississauga, and many of his findings have been converted to new regulations governing the railways. CP Rail says it has followed those safety orders to the letter.
We don't want a derailment any more than the neighbors do, than anyone else does. They are a very costly affair, they're disruptive, and they are dangerous to life and limb.
A hotbox detector like this would have detected the overheated bearing that caused the Mississauga disaster. CP says it has installed 255 detectors outside major Canadian cities. It is changing the bearings on tankers, improving communication and public education, and improving methods of assembling and marking trains full of hazardous cargoes. But those trains continue to roll through some of Toronto's most densely populated neighborhoods. More than 20,000 cars of hazardous cargo every year. Although speeds have been cut, residents are still concerned.
If something isn't regulated, it will happen again in a populated area. And we're standing here within a couple of hundred meters of a school where there are small children, and if something happens, somebody is going to get killed.
One federal report suggested that all hazardous cargoes be routed on CN track north of Toronto, but CP says such a move would cost $1 billion. The woman at the eye of the hurricane in 1979, Mayor Hazel McCallion, says she's pleased today with the follow-up to the disaster.
Even though it cost the city of Mississauga a considerable amount of money, cost the businesses and residents of Mississauga great inconvenience as well as cost, I think that the city of Mississauga has made a major contribution towards the way in which future disasters will be handled.
The evacuation of 250,000 people also remained a record until Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005. The city of Mississauga sued Canadian Pacific to recoup some of the costs of the massive emergency services bill. The city eventually dropped the suit after Canadian Pacific agreed to drop its opposition to passenger service on its tracks near Mississauga. This allowed for GO Transit to open the Milton line only 2 years later. Mississauga band Death from Above 1979 immortalized the event in their 2014 album, The Physical World, with the song Trainwreck 1979. Larry Krupa, the hero who prevented a further disaster, he was awarded the Order of Canada for his bravery and inducted into the North America Railway Hall of Fame. As for Hazel McCallion, she was elected mayor of Mississauga for the next 3 decades, until her retirement in 2014 at the age of 93. On the 40th anniversary of the disaster, she said, "I don't know of any other thing that has happened in my 36 years as mayor that was as serious and as demanding and as stressful as the Mississauga derailment." Hazel McCallion died on January 29, 2023 at the age of 101. And thanks to her and many others who fought the flames and assisted evacuees, thousands of other people got to live long, full lives after the disaster as well. I hope you enjoyed that and our look at the Mississauga train derailment. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com. or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.